Hello beautiful people, welcome back to my YouTube channel. So I was in the middle of doing my coursework the other day and I was trying to look up some stop and search statistics, and I just so happened to come across an article that was about the Brixton Uprising. So I clicked on the article and the article was celebrating the 40-year anniversary of the Brixton Uprising, and I thought to myself, wow, it's been 40 years already. I felt really compelled to make a video discussing the Brixton Uprising because this is one of the key events when talking about Black British history. I can't believe that no one is really talking about it. I'm actually in disbelief at the fact that I just so happened to stumble across the article. I probably wouldn't have been made aware of it if I didn't look up the stop and search statistics. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the events that took place leading up to the uprising, what triggered it, and whether or not things have actually really changed in 40 years. But before I move on, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe at the end of the video. I made a video almost a year back talking about the systemic racism in the UK. I briefly spoke on the racial tensions that took place between the 70s and the 80s. However, I didn't go in too much detail, but I will in this video. I'm sure that we're all aware of the Windrush Generation, but for those who aren't aware, the Windrush Generation centres around a scheme that was put in place by the British government that involved Afro-Caribbeans being asked to come over to the UK to help rebuild the British economy and to contribute to the British workforce. When talking about the Windrush Generation, a lot of us tend to have this idea that the Windrush Generation was very passive, this general belief that they romanticised the idea of living in the United Kingdom and that they didn't have an issue with the blatant racism and discrimination that they experienced when they came to this country. What a lot of people tend to overlook is that this is a group of people who have migrated to another country, who are trying to adopt the customs, trying to assimilate to the culture, trying to build lives for themselves and their children, and trying to contribute to the workforce in a system that was constructed to ensure that Black people could not reach their full potential. They had jobs, and a lot of them faced a lot of racial discrimination within the workplace that they had no choice but to accept because they needed to make money in order to provide for their children and to keep a roof over their heads. Not to mention, housing was very racist during that time. It still is, but was even more blunt back then. So if they did lose their homes, it would be very hard for them to find another one because of how racist housing was. The point is, they had a lot to lose, and whilst of course you had those that rebelled against it, you had those that needed to move strategically because they had children to take into consideration. Moreover, you had some that just felt like they had no right to complain because to some, moving to the United Kingdom was the opportunity of a lifetime, like being given this opportunity to work and to live in the quote motherland. The general idea amongst some of them was, what do I have to complain about? I'm in a privileged position. Tensions were rising between the second-generation British-born Afro-Caribbeans and the police. They were on the receiving end of a lot of racial attacks and abuse by the public and the police. I watched a documentary about the Brixton Uprising, and one gentleman on there spoke about being harassed by the police like almost every single week. Whenever he was arrested for no reason, he would get into trouble by his father, and his father would always tell him, keep out of trouble. He would always try to explain to his father that the only reason he was being targeted was because of the colour of his skin, and his father just didn't believe him. The parents of the second generation held the police in high regards and just had a tough time believing that some of them were using their powers to unfairly target Black people, Black men in particular. For most, there are three key events that stood out in terms of triggering the Brixton Uprising. Those were the New Cross fires, the high unemployment rate in the Black community, and the Sus Law. The New Cross fire was a fire that took place at a house party that celebrated the birthday of Yvonne Rudolph and Angela Jackson. There was high levels of racial tensions in New Cross. During the birthday celebration, a fire broke out, subsequently claiming the lives of 13 Black youths. Given the National Front was very active in New Cross during that time, it was believed that someone from the National Front started that fire. Till this day, no arrest has been made. During the early 80s, when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, there was a huge wave of mass unemployment in Britain that hit the Black community the worst, leaving 50% of Black people unemployed and living in poverty. The Sus Law was a legislation that was introduced by the government that gave police powers to stop and search anyone that they believed was about to commit an arrestable act or a crime. Guess who was unfairly targeted the most when that legislation was introduced? I'll wait. Between the 10th and the 12th of April 1981, thousands of black youths took to the streets of Brixton to confront the Metropolitan Police. This ultimately led to 82 arrests, 279 police officers being injured, 45 members of the public being injured, buildings were destroyed and vehicles were burnt. Many legislations were designed to help build bridges between the black community and the police. For example, PACE was introduced. PACE stands for the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, and this was a legislation that was introduced to regulate police powers and to also protect the rights of the public. Within PACE were codes of practices that allowed for detainees to record any altercation that took place between them and the police. This was put in place to encourage professionalism amongst the police force. The Scarman Report was also introduced, that was commissioned by the UK government following the Brixton Uprising, that looked into the inquiry of the uprising. This honestly depends on who you're asking, but if you're asking me, not really. Yes, there has been many legislation and schemes that have been put in place in order to eliminate police corruption. However, the system is still systemically racist. 18 years after the Brixton riots, the Macpherson Report was introduced that looked into the brutal murder of Stephen Lawrence. The Macpherson Report concluded that the collapse of the investigation into the murder was down to a combination of professional incompetence, institutionalized racism, and failure of leadership. There's also still an overrepresentation of black people in the penal system, and we only make up 3% of the entire British population. Not to mention, the black community was hit the hardest since the pandemic, leaving 40% of black youths unemployed. When talking about systemic racism, it's like taking 5 steps forward and 4 steps back. You have something traumatic that hits the black community, and yes, it makes the news, you have protests, and in some cases schemes and legislations are put in place in order to ensure nothing like that happens again, but we end up being knocked sideways by something new. With the Breonna Taylor case, you had people talking about it, there was protest, and a lot of us thought that there would be a conviction, only for him to be acquitted. There comes a point where we need to start being honest with ourselves. Even if they do implement policies that try to eradicate or to keep on top of systemic racism, it only ends up working until a certain point, and then black people will go back to having to deal with the same BS that we've been suffering for almost 500 years now. Anyway, this is just my take on the entire situation. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Do you think a lot has changed since the Brixton Uprising? If you liked the video, please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and don't forget to share the video.